The Darkangel, Chapter 3. The Durrer. "We will not hurt you," said one of the wraiths. "We cannot," said another. "Most of us are too weak to stand." "It is perhaps the weight of these garments," another said. Or perhaps it was the first again. They all moved about constantly, rocking or pacing before and behind her. Ariel could not keep her eye on them at all, and all of them had the same face, save that some of them were more or less withered than others. "Our garments and our bones," another told her. "And the years, and the tears." "The other one wove us garments," she said. "They were of seed silk," said one of the wraiths. "But we were growing so thin that already they drag us down." They moved a little closer, and Ariel fell back until she pressed against the wall. A musty fragrance came from them, reminding her of ashes and root cellars. She watched the wraiths. "You must weave us kirtles of finer stuff, mouse hair, or bird song, or breath." They looked at her with their hollows for eyes, and some of them nodded. Ariel shrank away. "Which one of you is Edwin?" she whispered. Her voice would not say steady otherwise. "Oh, we have all lost our names by this time," they replied. "Which of you was the first to come here?" The wraiths looked at each other in a puzzlement. "We do not know," said one. "Our memories fade, then come again. None of us can now remember back much further than a day-month, and there were always many of us a day-month ago." Ariel suppressed a shudder. "Why does he keep you here?" "We keep ourselves," said the wraiths. "If we wandered freely about this great castle, we would surely lose ourselves. What little there is left of us to lose." Ariel grimaced at the creature's closeness. "Why are you afraid of us?" said another of the wraiths. "What has he done to you?" cried Ariel softly, able to keep her revulsion hidden no longer. "You were women once." "True," said one. "We were like you, but prettier." "What has he done to you?" said Ariel again. "Drunk up our blood, stolen our souls, torn our hearts and thrown them to the gargoyles." Ariel turned away from them and groped for the door. "Where are you going?" cried the wraiths. "I," began Ariel, finding the doorway with her hand. "Do not leave us." I must find the garden." "We have no one to talk to," said one of the wraiths. You have each other," stammered Ariel, brushing away one slender mummy hand that reached out to catch a pleat of her kirtle and tug her back. "We are all almost the same," sighed the wraiths. "Talking to each other is only a little more or less like talking to oneself." I must go," choked Ariel, gathering her kirtle more closely about her than the delicate pulls and pinches of their hesitant, outreaching hands. "Go," they told her, "but come back." "I will come back," she heard herself promise. Anything to be gone, and then she ran. The garden lay on the north face of the castle above the cliffside, and had grown quite wild in the years since it had been tended. Silvery spindle grass threaded up through the pavement. Across the footpaths snaked sinewy creepers, their long twining tendrils dotted by wine-scented blossoms with petals of gold. Elsewhere in the garden the firethorn was in flower, and beside it the brittle fruit stood blooming, its branches unladen as yet with sweet crystalline droops. Ariel wandered amid the flowers and the foliage, pausing now and again to peer through the frowns of white fig, or sought through the leaves of the owl's featherwort in search of fruit or seed or nut, but there were none, and slowly she began to wonder whether this might not be a garden arrested in mid-season, where everything flowered but nothing came to fruit, nor perhaps ever would, wither and die. Ariel was hungry. Solstar had climbed 12 degrees in the black starry heavens since she had last eaten, and more than that since she had last tasted water. The nectarine scents of the flowers made her stomach twist with hunger. Her throat was close and dry. She had begun to feel light-headed and dizzy. She spotted a statue in the sunlight only a few paces from her, a little man about 3 feet high. He had a quizzical face and a long twining beard. Ariel approached the stone figure, leaned against it for support. But he was not a statue, she discovered. Only a moment after her shadow fell across him, he slowly blinked and then pursed his lips and stretched. "Well, merciful darkness, girl," he sighed. "I thought you'd never—" "Don't move!" he cried as Ariel leapt back in surprise. As she said it, he jumped with her, so he remained in her shadow. "Now keep your wits, girl," he continued quickly. "I couldn't hurt you if I wanted, and I can be of help to you if you'll have me." Who are you?" said Ariel hesitantly, more intrigued than frightened. "You may call me Taub," the little man said with a bow, still careful to remain in her shadow. "It is not my name, but then one must be careful just whom one hands one's name out to these days. And who, may I inquire, are you?" "My name is Ariel," she replied. "I come from the foot of the steeps of Touraine." "That far?" said the little man. "Well, he must have brought you, then. Not one of his new brides, I hope. But no, you're not wasted enough, and it's too soon. Besides, may we stand out of the sun, mistress?" Here the little man's tone grew petulant. "It's rather awkward trying to stand here in your shadow and you keep bending and cocking your head to peer at me. Perhaps the songbriar over there?" He gestured and Ariel nodded. They walked carefully to the shade of the leafy songbriar and sat down on the grassy lime rock. "You're his new maid, I suppose," said the little man, straightening the sleeves of his robe. The air about him smelled like old parchment and calf. "I'm to spin," replied Ariel, "for his wives." "Oh," said the other with some distaste. "Those awful wraiths. They wail, did you know? Worse than the gargoyles. I've tried talking to them, once or twice. Witless things. I think their brain pans must be empty." Ariel looked at him. "I find them pitiable," she said, trying hard to put down her repulsion. She had promised to go back. "Grotesque, perhaps, but it's not their fault." "Oh, without a doubt, the little man agreed. "But not much company." Ariel looked off across the garden. What are you?" she asked him. "And from where do you come?" The little man's tangled eyebrows rose. "I'm a Durra!" he cried, almost indignant. "Can't you tell? I come from the ground, from the caves under the ground, from the great caves, from the jewelled caverns. I was a treasurer to the late king in my time, kept the vast storehouses brimming with jewels, all empty now. There is only the lime crystal left in the caves, though that is lovely." His voice trailed off and his little stone-grey eyes grew moist remembering. "What were you doing in the garden?" Ariel asked him in a moment when he did not continue. "That is, why were you standing so still?" She was afraid to admit she'd taken him for a statue. Said her companion, coming out of his thoughts. "Ah, yes, well, I'm a Durra. As I said, are you sure you've not heard of us? We do well enough by dark, or starlight, or earthlight, or even lamplight. But the light of Solstar blinds us, halts us in mid-step, turns us to stone. You might say we can't look away." He chuckled softly and stretched again and yawned. "I had just come out in the pre-dawn for a bit of fresh air, but I'm afraid that I dozed, and the sunrise caught me. I was glad when you stumbled across me. I was afraid I should have to stand there all day month till sunset, staring into that wretched star." Ariel felt her hunger returning as his initial surprise faded. "You said you could help me," she said in a moment. "Ah, yes, and I can," said the Durra. "So I can. I tried to help the one before you, but she wouldn't listen. At first she was of good heart and as gay as could be expected, but the day-months grew long and she began to look weary as the wraiths, hollow-cheeked and hollow-eyed." The little man sighed and shook his head. She knew she mustn't run away, but she kept straying down to the steps in the cliff face that led down to the plain. One day she took them. Poor thing, she didn't get very far. The gargoyles saw her escaping almost at once and raised the alarm. Dreadful sound. The Durra looked at Ariel. "I suppose that is why he brought you here to replace her." "Please," said Ariel. She was feeling faint. "Is there any food in this garden?" "Ah, food!" her companion cried, as if suddenly remembering himself. "Of course. No, there's no food in this place, but if you follow me, I'll take you to my caves, where there's food and in plenty. The caverns were vast, great hollows in the bedrock on which the castle stood. They stretched on in a winding chain, far beyond the limit of the pale rushlight the Durrow held up high. A gleaming river ran out of the endless chain of caverns to the left, through the high-ceilinged natural hall into which they were emerging, and away down to the right, where Iriel could hear the water splashing echoed back through a myriad of long vaulted chambers. "Where does it lead?" said Iriel. "Miles and miles," the Durrow replied. "Oh, heavens, child, I've never had time to follow. All the way to eternity for all I know." He hopped off the last step of the tunnel stairs they'd taken down into the earth from the garden. "Now come along," he said. "We shall have to wade." He stepped out onto the sandy bank, and Iriel followed. The sand lay smooth and white as sawdust, felt at the same time soft and gritty. The water was warm, the current swift but not treacherous, and Iriel realized its light was not merely the reflection of the Durrow's torch, but an actual property of the river. Iriel stopped in mid-stream, cupped her hands to taste the water and brought it to her lips. There was a taste of minerals to it, vaguely saline, and a soothing, almost herbal fragrance. It settled her stomach and steadied her. She drank again and followed the Durrow to the opposite bank. He led her along the cavern-walled end for a little way. It was of smooth white limestone and sprang up only a pace or two from the river-bank. They came to a place where the wall doubled back a step, though the river did not, before running on, and there in the shadow of that narrow niche was an ivory door, invisible until the Durrow held up his rushlight to it and pushed it aside. It gave easily. There was a narrow passage for a few steps, and then there was a great chamber of white limestone, bare of anything but a small heap of sticks in the middle. They burned merrily, leapt in white flame. Being dry and grey as desert driftwood, the Durrow went forward into the chamber. His rush was almost burnt out, and he tossed it into the little blaze. "Come, girl," said the Durrow, "sit by the fire and rest while I fetch us some food, for I have not eaten in as long as you, probably longer." Then he hobbled off across the room. His legs were very short, and he disappeared through a door in the wall, one Iriel had not noticed before. It was, like the other, carefully concealed by the shadows and unevenness of the wall. She sat by the fire watching the pungent wood smoke rise to the ceiling in a thin white line, where it pooled and filled with little pots and pockets there. Iriel had never seen a wood fire before. The people in her village burned oil in lamps and jars or candles. Presently she heard the Durrow returning on the other side of the little door, ambling along and mumbling a quiet tune to himself. His arms were laden with fruits and berries. He knelt down beside the fire and spread them all out. Iriel sat staring at the quantity and variety of it all. "Well, eat," the Durrow said, "and you had best be quick, or I shall eat it all to myself." Then he immediately fell to, and Iriel followed. There were quinces and lemons and pale mauve citrons, pearl nuts and fanworts and pumpkins of gold. There were bitter gum saproot and a taproot of cane, squat milky mushrooms sweeter than nut meat and smoother than curd. There was fish too, dead ones. Iriel was astonished. "You eat them?" she asked the Durrow. "Fish?" "Certainly, daughter," the Durrow replied, offering her some. "That's what they're for." Iriel tasted a bit of the moist white flesh. It was warm and tender on her tongue. "But they're dead," said Iriel. "How is it their bodies have not fallen into ash?" Mumbled the Durrow, munching on almonds now. "Oh, the cooking does that." Iriel ate of the little man's provender until no more was left, for the Durrow, it seemed, was fully as hungry as she. She realized that, after all, he had not eaten since before sunrise, though since he had been dead stone most of the while and not living flesh. She was surprised he would have developed such an appetite at any rate. It made no matter, for between them both they had quite enough. "Where does all this come from?" asked Iriel when they were done. Her host was busy collecting the leavings of the feast. "The food from the caves, from the stream," he said, looking up. "Here is life." "The water," said Iriel. "It's warm. Where does it come from?" "From the ground, daughter, from the earth." Iriel felt a frown creasing her brow. "But it's warm," she said. "Water out of the ground is cold." The Durra nodded. Aye, still water, dead water, but this is real water, girl. It runs and glows and bubbles with life. But so much of it, answered Iriel, thinking of the depth and breadth of the stream. Much, her companion cried. That's barely a trickle. Ah, if you could have seen the caves of Adelan as I did in my childhood, he sighed. Water still fell from the sky in my youth, and swelled the rivers. We called it rain. From the sky? Said Iriel. How long ago were the days of your youth? The Durra sighed. 12,000 day-months passed, he said, and he fell silent for a little while space. Presently he glanced at Ariel again. Well, where did you think the water went when the seas receded and the land arose? He laughed. Underground, daughter, underground. Here is life. Iriel swallowed the last quince seed, smiled a little timidly and said nothing. Come, the Durra said, pocketing the last of the scraps. Are you rested? I want to show you the caves. Now this, the Durra said, rising from beside the little fire where he and Iriel had had their repast. He dusted off the backside of his robe and then his hands. This used to be the great treasure room. It's quite empty, of course, now. They took it all with them when the Queen and her people removed across the sea of dust the Easterness. All that is except the blade of adamantine, which was lost in these caves long ago. He still comes down here looking for it sometimes. Who? Said Iriel, rising with him now from the hard-lime floor. The vampire, of course, the Durra replied. Surely you know the prophecy? No. The wardens of the world, where have you lived all your life, child? That only by the hoof of the star-horse and the edge of the adamant may he be undone, and his 6 brethren with him. They are invulnerable to blades of mortals, but the blade adamantine was not forged in this world by mortals, but by the ancestors, the ancients, the heaven-born of Oceanus. He eyed Iriel closely, and then she gazed back at him with a frown of puzzlement. Child, have you never heard of the heaven-born? Iriel shook her head. Only in whispers and oaths, she answered, and prayers. She remembered her own desperate petition to the unknown nameless ones as she had ascended the steeps long ago that dawn, and blushed now to think of her presumption. She did not even know so much about them as their names. Not heard of the heaven-born? Why, it was they who grafted life onto the land. This planet was a dead world before they came. They unlocked the water from the ground, created the atmosphere, and bound it lest it bleed off into the heavens. They found all the old seeds lying dormant and revived them. They bred their own herbs with them to create new plants for this world. He gestured about him as if to take in the whole planet. Iriel stared at him in wonder. They brought animals, he said, newly created for this world, and us. Even us they made, daughter, to farm the land and mine the caves. He folded his arms, and then he shook his head. They themselves lived in domed cities in the desert, for the air was too thin for them to breathe for long and live. He sighed. They were our creators and our guides, for they were very, very wise, but they are all gone now. Great wars on their homeland destroyed them, or perhaps it was only their ships they lost, so they could no longer plunge across the deep heaven from their far world of blue water and cloud. Iriel gazed at him and felt weak, marvelling at his knowledge. He shrugged a little and smiled ever so slightly. Perhaps we shall yet live to see them come again, he sighed, but enough of this. The caves. Come with me. He bent to lift a piece of burning driftwood from the fire, and he led her out of the great storehouse through the hidden door that he had taken to fetch the food. Iriel followed him through a long series of lesser chambers that had been, the Durra said, storehouses of the greatest treasures, rooms unknown to any but the king and queen of the castle and their treasurer, and always from their left as they walked came the sound of running water. If ever you get lost in these caves, her guide informed her, just follow the water and you'll find your way out. Presently the tunnel of rooms bore right a little, and Iriel could hear the water ahead of them as well as from the left. They came to the last room, which seemed to end with no door to a chamber beyond, but the Durra walked on without pause to the far corner, though it was no smooth straight joining of planes, for all the rooms were rounded and irregular in shape. and he slipped through a little door that Iriel could not see until she was almost upon it. They emerged onto the sandy bank of the river, upstream from where they'd been. Iriel turned and started down the bank for the stairs up to the garden, the last step of which she could just make out around the far bend, but the Durra turned upstream. "Come along," he said. "There is a way out closer than that." Iriel turned and followed him. "May I come down to these caves sometimes?" she inquired. "They are very beautiful, far more beautiful than the Icarus's castle." "I should say," the Durra replied, "and by much. Here there is life, and that cold tor up there holds only death and death. And as for the coming down sometimes, of certain you may. You will have to if you want to eat, and I shall welcome you. I haven't had someone to talk to for ages." They waded back across the stream. "The other one before you," the Durra continued. "She stopped talking after a while. Those loathsome wraiths did it to her, I'm sure. Poor dear. She went quite mad, as they do in the end. Here we are now." He had reached the narrow stair, which instead of carving a tunnel into the rock in the garden stair had done, it was cut into the side of the rock face and ascended the wall in a slippery, uneven row of steps. The Durra motioned her up to the stair ahead of him. The white torchlight wavered and danced behind her now as she ascended into the shadows where the light of the river barely reached. "Where does this lead?" she asked the Durra. "Up to the castle," he said. "It opens into the corridor by the servants' quarters. There are some nice rooms about. You might like to choose one of them as your own, and it's away from the noise of the gargoyles and the wraiths when they decide to start moaning. Oh, I almost forgot." Iriel paused on the stair and half turned, for her torch-bearer had stopped and was now rummaging in the many folds of his full grey robe. "Ah," he said, and drew from his pocket a little object of gold. Not the white zinc gold or pale electrum her people usually called gold, but true fallow gold, more tawny than anything Iriel had ever seen before in her life. "You'll need this if you intend to spin for the wraiths," said the Durra, and handed it to her. "Your spindle." It was indeed a spindle, tiny enough to cup in the hand, but weighty as lead. Iriel held it in her hands and wondered at the delicacy of its make. "One of the few trinkets the Queen left behind," he informed her. "But," said Iriel at last, "how shall I use it? I found nothing as yet to spin." "Nor you will," said the Durra. "If you mean to search in the garden or the castle for flax silk or fibre, there is none. No, what you spin must be of yourself." "I've not hair enough on all my head to make even one kirtle," stammered Iriel, and at this the Durra laughed, a surprisingly hearty, deep-throated laugh for such a little man. "I can see you're not acquainted with the singular properties of this golden spindle," he said, after a moment regaining himself. "This spindle spins from the heart, child. Joy, sorrow, anger, hate. Whatever you feel in your heart, this spindle will spin. The last one, the one before you, she spun it all on pity and loathing. That was all she could manage in the company of those dreadful wraiths, and I can little blame her. But such garments fall to pieces in only a scant time, and they're too heavy for the wraiths to bear. No, I think you must find something else to spin on this spindle, daughter. Go along now. The door to the castle is only a few steps up." "But what am I to spin if not pity and loathing?" said Iriel, astonished. "What else can one feel for such poor creatures?" Then almost to herself, "And how am I to make a thread of my heart's feeling? Any feeling at all?" But the Durra had already turned and started down the steps. "Oh, I've no idea, child," he called over one shoulder. "We Durras are miners and scholars, not spinners. You must learn in your own way and in your own time how to use it as well as what to spin." And Iriel was left standing quite bewildered, with the golden spindle in one hand, until she realized she had best turn and find the door into the castle quickly before the Durra and his light receded too far down the steps.